Sarojini Naidu, born on February 13, 1879, in Hyderabad, India, emerged as one of the most influential figures in Indian literature and politics. Known as the Nightingale of India for her lyrical poetry, Naidu's early years laid the foundation for both her literary genius and her later political activism. She was the eldest of 8 children in a progressive and intellectual family. Her father, Agornath Chattopadhyay, was a distinguished scientist and philosopher, while her mother, Bharatachandri Devi, was a poetess who imbued Sarojini with a love for literature and the arts from a young age. The nurturing environment in her household, combined with exposure to literature, was instrumental in shaping her character and intellectual pursuits. From an early age, Naidu exhibited a keen interest in reading and writing, and her prodigious talent in these areas became evident as she grew. At the age of 12, she had already composed a lengthy play, Marmuner, in English, which was later published. This early work demonstrated her creative abilities and command over the English language, an achievement uncommon for an Indian girl in that era. Naidu's exceptional literary talent caught the attention of her mentors and contemporaries, and it was during her childhood that she began to carve out her place as a budding writer. In terms of formal education, Naidu's early schooling took place in Hyderabad, where she was raised. At the time, there were limited educational opportunities for women in India, but Naidu's father, who was an advocate for women's education, ensured that she received an education in line with her intellectual potential. At the age of 16, Sarojini Naidu moved to England to further her education, enrolling at King's College London. Here, she was exposed to a wider range of literary traditions and thinkers, particularly the works of the Romantics and the Pre-Raphaelites, which would later influence her own poetry. During her time in London, she also attended Girton College, Cambridge, where she developed a deep connection with English literature. While Naidu's education in England provided her with a strong foundation in Western literary traditions, it also introduced her to a more global worldview. She was particularly drawn to the works of poets like Tennyson, Shelley, and Keats, whose romanticism resonated with her own sensibilities. The beauty and vividness of their verse were qualities Naidu would adopt in her own writing, giving her poetry a sensuous quality that later became one of her hallmarks. However, despite her immersion in Western education, Naidu never lost touch with her Indian roots. Her works often fused Western literary forms with themes and imagery drawn from Indian culture, creating a unique blend of tradition and modernity. Naidu's time abroad was not just about academic growth, but also about the development of her identity as an artist. It was during this period that she began to write poems that would later become her signature works. Her poetry was rich with the themes of love, nature, and patriotism, all of which were influenced by both the European literary tradition and the Indian cultural landscape. She was a keen observer of the world around her, and her poems often reflected her deep, emotional engagement with the beauty of life and nature. This phase in England marked the beginning of her journey as a poet whose works would resonate with a wide audience, both in India and abroad. Upon returning to India in 1898, Sarojini Naidu began to gain recognition for her poetry, and she quickly became a prominent figure in the literary and social circles of Bombay, now Mumbai. Her collection of poems in the bazaars of Hyderabad, published in 1912, earned her national acclaim. The poems were noted for their lyrical quality and vivid imagery, which captured the essence of Indian life, especially the vibrancy of Indian markets and traditions. Naidu's ability to evoke a sense of place and culture through her poetry was one of the reasons why her work resonated so deeply with Indian readers. However, her poetry was not merely a reflection of Indian life. It also captured the universal themes of love, longing, and loss. Naidu's academic journey and her early literary endeavors were not just a personal achievement, but a symbolic representation of the changing dynamics of Indian society. She was part of a growing movement in India that sought to combine Western education with traditional Indian values, creating a unique intellectual space for women. In many ways, her education and literary achievements embodied the aspirations of the emerging Indian middle class, who sought to modernize while preserving their cultural heritage. Her education also exposed her to ideas that went beyond the literary sphere. Naidu's early exposure to political ideas and thinkers in England helped shape her views on nationalism and the role of women in society. The combination of her literary pursuits and her burgeoning political awareness set the stage for her later involvement in the Indian independence movement. In this sense, her early years in education were not just about developing her intellectual capacity, but also about shaping the trajectory of her life as a poet, activist, and leader. Her education in both India and England played a significant role in her development as a writer and a public figure. Naidu's experiences abroad helped her refine her literary style, while her time in India gave her a deeper understanding of her country's cultural and political realities. It was this combination of Western education and Indian sensibilities that made Sarojini Naidu a unique figure in the literary and political landscape of India. Her upbringing, shaped by intellectual rigor and artistic sensibility, prepared her for the roles she would play in both the literary world and the struggle for India's independence. As Sarojini Naidu continued to evolve as a writer, her early years laid the groundwork for the remarkable journey she would undertake. The education she received and the literary influences she absorbed became integral to her identity as a poet, while her exposure to the world of politics would steer her toward a lifetime of activism. Sarojini Naidu's connection to poetry was not merely an intellectual pursuit, but a profound emotional and spiritual journey that shaped much of her life. From her early childhood, the influence of her mother's poetry and the intellectual atmosphere of her home in Hyderabad imbued her with a sense of reverence for language and the arts. As she matured, Sarojini's passion for poetry evolved, moving from innocent musings to a refined craft that engaged with both personal expression and national consciousness. Poetry became, for Naidu, a channel through which she could give voice to her deepest emotions and aspirations while weaving the vibrant threads of Indian culture into a universal narrative. Naidu's early literary works displayed an affinity for Romanticism, a style she would embrace throughout her career, drawing inspiration from the great poets of the English literary canon, such as Keats, Shelley, and Tennyson. She crafted verses that were rich in lyrical beauty and emotional depth. Her works often mirrored the ideals of love, nature, and longing, and they were imbued with a sense of yearning that connected her to the themes of Romanticism, which she had encountered during her years in England. However, while these influences shaped her style, Sarojini Naidu's poetry was far from derivative. Her works were laced with her unique voice, one that was sensitive to the nuances of Indian life, history, and spirituality. What set Sarojini Naidu apart from many of her contemporaries was her ability to capture the essence of Indian culture in a manner that was both accessible to Western audiences and deeply resonant with her Indian readership. Through her evocative descriptions, she brought to life the landscapes of India, its marketplaces, its streets, and the rhythms of daily life. In this respect, she achieved a synthesis of Western poetic forms and Indian sensibilities, which would become a hallmark of her literary identity. For example, in her famous poem In the Bazaars of Hyderabad, she vividly painted a picture of the bustling markets, where every image was laden with sensory detail. The rich imagery of the markets, the descriptions of vibrant goods, and the interplay of sound and color transported the reader to a sensory world that felt both exotic and familiar. Naidu's poetry was not confined solely to descriptive works. It was also a means through which she engaged with broader social and political issues. Her growing awareness of India's colonial struggles and the rising tide of nationalism influenced her later works, which reflected a more politically conscious and patriotic voice. Early poems like Indian Weavers and the Song of India exemplified her ability to blend her love for her country with her artistic sensibilities. In these works, she voiced her concern for the plight of the nation under British rule, articulating a vision of a united, self-determined India. As her literary career progressed, Naidu's themes expanded to include not only the beauty of India's landscapes and its people, but also the social realities of her time. Her early education and exposure to social reformers and intellectuals encouraged her to weave elements of social commentary into her poetry. Naidu did not shy away from addressing issues like the plight of women, child marriage, and the caste system, all of which were deeply entrenched in Indian society. In her poem, The Gift of India, for instance, she poignantly captures the sacrifice of Indian soldiers during World War I, positioning them as the gift that India offered to the world. In this poem, she transforms the personal and the national into a call for unity and national pride. Naidu's poetry also grappled with themes of identity and belonging. The idea of India's ancient heritage, intertwined with its modern aspirations, frequently surfaced in her works. This tension between tradition and change was particularly evident in her collection, The Broken Wing, which explored themes of love, loss, and personal sacrifice. The image of the broken wing served as a metaphor for both the personal struggles of individuals and the collective aspirations of a nation striving for freedom. The deep sense of pathos in this collection highlighted Sarojini's ability to blend personal sorrow with national grief, a theme that would resonate strongly as she became more involved in the Indian independence movement. Throughout her life, Naidu continued to refine her poetic style. Her use of rhythm, meter, and alliteration contributed to the musical quality of her verse. This musicality was central to her success as a poet, as it allowed her to evoke emotions in a way that felt both immediate and timeless. It was not uncommon for Sarojini Naidu to recite her own poetry in public, and her captivating voice and presence amplified the emotional impact of her words. Her public readings became an integral part of her identity as a poet and as a woman who used her art as a tool for expression and advocacy. Naidu's work was recognized not only in India, but also in the international literary community. She was often invited to read her poetry at various gatherings, including prestigious events in London and other parts of Europe. Her first major publication, In the Bazaars of Hyderabad, 1912, was met with widespread acclaim and marked her as a poet of exceptional promise. The collection, which was published by the prestigious Macmillan and Company, introduced Naidu to a wider audience and was celebrated for its vivid portrayal of Indian life through the lens of a poet who had both the language and the cultural insight to capture the country's essence. While she was deeply embedded in the world of literature, Naidu's poetry also reflected her awareness of the shifting social and political landscape in India. As her exposure to the Indian nationalist movement deepened, her poetry began to include more overt references to the struggle for independence. This shift was particularly evident in her later works, which spoke to the collective struggle of the Indian people, urging them to rise against colonial oppression. In this sense, Sarojini Naidu's poetry became not only an expression of individual emotion, but also a tool for collective empowerment. By the time she had established herself as a prominent poet, Sarojini Naidu had become a symbol of India's intellectual and artistic awakening. Her poetic style, characterized by its emotive depth, lyrical beauty, and cultural richness, earned her a revered place in both Indian and global literary history. Naidu's ability to move between the personal and the political, to blend the romantic with the national, made her a singular figure in the literary world. As her fame spread, she remained a voice that resonated with both the individual and the nation, capturing the complexities of love, identity, and freedom in a way that few poets had managed before her. Sarojini Naidu's academic pursuits and her travels played a crucial role in shaping both her worldview and literary expression. After completing her early education in Hyderabad, she moved to England in 1895 at the age of 16 to further her studies. The decision to send her abroad was largely influenced by the progressive outlook of her father, Agornath Chattopadhyay, who believed strongly in the importance of a well-rounded education for his children, particularly his daughter. England, with its prestigious educational institutions and rich intellectual environment, provided Sarojini with a broader horizon and exposed her to the varied streams of European thought and culture. Naidu enrolled at King's College London, where she studied a wide range of subjects, including history, literature, and the sciences. Although she was particularly drawn to literature, the intellectual rigor of her studies at King's College was formative in honing her analytical skills. It was during this time that she became more deeply engaged with the works of the Romantic poets and began exploring the nuances of English literature. Her exposure to the intellectual atmosphere at King's College and her interactions with like-minded students and professors played a significant role in the development of her poetic voice, which would later reflect both her admiration for Western literary traditions and her deep-rooted Indian sensibilities. During her time in London, Naidu's intellectual curiosity expanded beyond the classroom. She developed a fascination with European history, particularly the cultural and political movements that had shaped the continent. She immersed herself in the works of poets like Tennyson, Shelley, and Byron, whose emphasis on individual emotion and the sublime had a lasting impact on her writing style. These poets' focus on nature, love, and loss resonated with Sarojini's own personal experiences and aspirations, and their influence can be seen throughout her early works. However, while she adopted many stylistic elements from these poets, Naidu was always careful to imbue her writing with an Indian sensibility that would later distinguish her from her European counterparts. At Girton College, Cambridge, where she continued her studies, Naidu found herself at the center of a vibrant intellectual community that championed women's education. The college, known for its progressive approach, provided a platform for Sarojini to further develop her intellectual and literary inclinations. It was here that she first began to develop the sense of independence and self-confidence that would characterize her later work in both the literary and political spheres. Her exposure to the works of feminist thinkers and the burgeoning women's rights movement in England further fueled her sense of social justice and equality, ideas that would find their way into her poetry and activism. Although Sarojini Naidu's time in England was a period of intense intellectual growth, it was not without its challenges. As an Indian woman in an unfamiliar and often unfriendly social environment, she was forced to navigate the complexities of race, class, and gender. However, rather than be deterred, Naidu used these challenges to strengthen her resolve. The experience of being an outsider in a foreign land only deepened her sense of identity as an Indian woman, and it reinforced her commitment to the cause of Indian independence. It was also during this period that Sarojini began to cultivate her distinctive voice, one that blended her Western education with a deep connection to her Indian roots. Her travels across Europe also broadened her horizons, offering her an opportunity to witness firsthand the cultural and social developments that were taking place in different countries. Whether visiting the grand cities of Paris and Florence or exploring the quieter landscapes of rural Europe, Naidu's travels were an essential part of her intellectual and emotional development. She absorbed the diverse cultural influences around her, but it was her exposure to the complexities of European colonialism that would have the most lasting impact on her political outlook. The experience of seeing the inequities of colonial rule in action strengthened her resolve to fight for India's freedom, a cause that would soon become her life's mission. Naidu's exposure to European philosophy and literature during her time abroad had a profound influence on her approach to poetry and social issues. However, it also provided her with a critical lens through which she would examine India's colonial reality. The encounter with Western intellectual traditions gave Sarojini a new understanding of the importance of political engagement in the fight for independence. Her travels confirmed her belief that literature could serve as a powerful tool for social and political change. Her academic pursuits, thus, became intertwined with her emerging sense of nationalistic duty, and her writing began to reflect not just personal or aesthetic concerns, but the urgent call for political action. Upon returning to India in 1898, Sarojini Naidu was no longer just a young poet with promise, but a woman who had developed a keen sense of social and political responsibility. Her academic experiences in England had shaped her into a multifaceted individual, an accomplished scholar, a poet with a distinct voice, and an emerging activist. As she began to make her presence felt in the literary and intellectual circles of Bombay, now Mumbai, Naidu's education provided the foundation for her advocacy of women's rights and her involvement in the Indian independence movement. Her travels and academic exposure had given her the tools to navigate both the literary world and the complex socio-political landscape of India, a combination that would be crucial as she embarked on her journey toward activism and leadership. In addition to her formal education, Sarojini Naidu's travels and exposure to diverse cultures allowed her to see the broader struggles for freedom and equality taking place around the world. These experiences help her forge a deeper understanding of the links between cultural identity and political liberation. Her travels reinforced the idea that the fight for Indian independence was not just about shaking off colonial rule, but about affirming the nation's cultural identity and asserting its place on the world stage. Naidu's understanding of political freedom thus expanded beyond mere nationalism to encompass a vision of a free and equal world for all people. The academic and travel experiences of Sarojini Naidu provided her with the intellectual and emotional tools to confront the complexities of Indian society and its colonial subjugation. Her education in England and her travels across Europe allowed her to synthesize different intellectual traditions and cultural perspectives, forming a worldview that was uniquely her own. Sarojini Naidu's literary career was one marked by an exquisite blend of lyrical poetry, vivid imagery, and emotional depth, as well as a unique fusion of Indian sensibilities with Western literary traditions. Throughout her life, Naidu's poetry not only captured the essence of India's rich cultural heritage, but also conveyed universal themes of love, longing, and patriotism. Her work traversed a wide range of subjects, from the beauty of nature and the celebration of Indian life to the pain of loss and the struggle for freedom. Naidu's poetry resonated deeply with readers in India and abroad, establishing her as one of the most prominent poets of the early 20th century. Naidu's first major publication, In the Bazaars of Hyderabad, 1912, quickly established her as a poet of exceptional promise. This collection of poems captured the colorful and lively scenes of Indian life, particularly in the bustling markets of Hyderabad. The poem, which gave the collection its title, became one of her signature works. In it, she painted a vivid picture of a traditional Indian bazaar, with its rich descriptions of goods, people, and the sights and sounds of everyday life. The poem's sensuous quality, coupled with its rhythmic flow, made it a favorite among readers. Sarojini's ability to transport her audience to the heart of Indian culture through her words became one of her defining characteristics as a poet. The emotional richness of Naidu's poetry was not limited to the descriptions of Indian life. It also extended to more personal and universal themes. Her poetry often explored the complexities of love, loss, and longing. Her poem, The Broken Wing, published in 1912, is one such example. In this poignant piece, Naidu uses the image of a broken-winged bird to convey the sorrow and pain of unrequited love and personal sacrifice. The poem's imagery was deeply symbolic, evoking both the fragility of the human spirit and the unfulfilled desires that often accompany love. The themes of heartbreak and loss resonated widely, making the poem one of her most beloved works. Naidu's ability to capture the emotional landscape of the human experience was matched by her sensitivity to the beauty of nature. In works such as The Lotus, Naidu beautifully explored the themes of purity, beauty, and spiritual awakening, drawing on the symbolism of the lotus flower to convey a deeper message of hope and resilience. The lotus, in Indian culture, is a symbol of divine beauty and spiritual enlightenment, and Naidu's use of this imagery allowed her to weave together the personal and the spiritual. Her lyrical ability to intertwine nature's beauty with themes of personal and spiritual growth added depth to her poetry, which was characterized by its richness and multifaceted layers of meaning. While Sarojini Naidu's early works primarily focused on themes of nature, love, and personal emotion, as her career progressed, her writing began to reflect her growing awareness of the political and social issues of the time. Her deepening engagement with the Indian independence movement and the rising tide of nationalism began to shape the content of her poetry. Her poems took on a more overtly political tone, with her patriotism and support for the struggle for freedom becoming central to her work. One of the most iconic poems from this period was Indian Weavers, which reflected on the traditional craft of weaving and used the metaphor of the weavers to speak about the struggles and sacrifices of the Indian people. The poem, with its rhythmic and lyrical structure, captured the unity and strength of the Indian nation, even in the face of adversity. Another significant work in this political phase was The Gift of India, written during World War I. In this poem, Naidu mourns the sacrifice of Indian soldiers who fought in the war, offering their lives in service to the British Empire. However, the poem also reflects Naidu's deep sense of sorrow and pride in her country's role in the war. Through her eloquent verses, she honors the soldiers while simultaneously asserting India's dignity and strength. The poem became a powerful voice of nationalist sentiment, using the sacrifices of the soldiers as a metaphor for the larger struggle for Indian independence. Naidu's ability to combine the personal with the political is perhaps best demonstrated in her later work. As her involvement in the Indian nationalist movement deepened, her poetry reflected the same urgency and intensity as the political struggles unfolding around her. In the Song of India, she explores the anguish and the hopes of the Indian people as they faced the brutal realities of colonial rule. The poem weaves together themes of loss, resistance, and national pride, offering a vision of India as a united and resilient force, despite the hardships imposed by British rule. In this sense, Naidu's poetry became a tool for expressing the collective spirit of India and a call to action in the fight for independence. Sarojini Naidu's major works were not confined to poems of resistance or celebration of Indian life alone. They also ventured into broader philosophical and existential questions. In The Golden Threshold, a collection of poems published in 1912, Naidu offered a more personal and introspective view of life. The collection, named after her childhood home in Hyderabad, includes works that explore themes of spirituality, identity, and the human condition. The poems in this collection reflect Sarojini's inner world and her contemplation of life's deeper meanings. In these poems, Naidu delves into the complexities of love, longing, and the search for truth, all while maintaining a sense of connection to her Indian heritage. Another important aspect of Naidu's literary career was her ability to weave together different literary traditions, incorporating elements of both Western and Indian literary forms. She was particularly adept at combining the rich oral traditions of India with the formal structures of English poetry. This blend allowed her to create a unique style that was both accessible and sophisticated. Her use of rhyme, rhythm, and meter gave her poetry a musical quality, which was one of the reasons why she was such a celebrated orator. Her public readings of her work, often accompanied by her captivating presence, were an important part of her literary career, allowing her to connect with audiences on a personal level. Sarojini Naidu's works were widely read and admired, not only in India, but also abroad. Her poetry was celebrated for its vibrant imagery, emotional depth, and universal appeal. Naidu's ability to capture the essence of India through her words made her an ambassador of Indian culture and literature to the Western world. As a poet, she bridged the gap between East and West, using her writing to highlight the richness of Indian traditions while also addressing global themes such as love, freedom, and social justice. Her works were published in international literary journals, and she was invited to read her poetry at various gatherings in Europe and the United States, solidifying her reputation as one of the foremost poets of her time. Sarojini Naidu's intellectual and literary pursuits were not confined solely to the realm of art and poetry. As the political landscape in India began to change, Naidu's commitment to the Indian independence movement became increasingly pronounced. She did not view her poetry and activism as separate endeavors. Instead, she saw them as complementary forces that could work together to inspire and mobilize the Indian masses. Her involvement in the Indian nationalist movement began in the early 1900s and grew over time, influenced by her deepening sense of national identity and her desire to contribute to India's struggle for freedom. Sarojini's introduction to political activism came at a time when India was in the midst of growing unrest against British colonial rule. The Indian National Congress, which had been founded in 1885, was emerging as the central political organization seeking to address issues of Indian autonomy and representation. Sarojini Naidu's early involvement with the Congress was spurred by the influence of her father, Agornath Chattopadhyay, who had been an outspoken advocate for education and reform in India. Her exposure to political discussions in her home, where the atmosphere was rich with intellectual and progressive debates, helped to form her political consciousness. Initially, Sarojini's entry into politics was somewhat tentative, primarily through her friendships with key political leaders and intellectuals such as Gopal Krishna Gokhale and Dadabhai Naoroji. She was drawn to their ideas of social justice and Indian self-governance, and her poetry began to reflect this growing awareness of the need for political change. However, it was her meeting with the fiery nationalist leader Lala Lajpat Rai that marked a decisive turning point in her political journey. Lala Lajpat Rai, a prominent figure in the Indian independence movement, inspired Naidu with his vision of an independent India and his belief in the power of the people to challenge colonial authority. Sarojini Naidu's relationship with the Indian National Congress deepened in the 1910s, particularly after she met key leaders such as Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. She admired Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance, or satyagraha, which emphasized the power of peaceful civil disobedience in the fight for independence. Her early involvement in Congress meetings and nationalist rallies provided her with a platform to voice her ideas on political freedom, and her poetic talents were often used to galvanize the people in their struggle for independence. Sarojini saw herself as a bridge between the intellectual elite and the common people, using her poetry as a tool to communicate the urgent need for self-rule. During the First World War, Naidu's political activities took on a new significance. Although India was under British colonial rule, a significant number of Indian soldiers had fought for the British Empire in the war. Sarojini Naidu, like many other nationalists, saw this as an opportunity to demand political concessions from the British government in exchange for India's contributions to the war effort. In 1917, she was one of the prominent leaders who participated in the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms movement, which called for increased Indian participation in the British administration. While the reforms were seen as a limited and inadequate response to the demands for self-rule, they marked a critical moment in the struggle for independence. Naidu's political activism also extended to issues of social justice and reform, particularly in the context of women's rights. A passionate advocate for women's education and emancipation, she became one of the foremost voices of the feminist movement in India. Naidu believed that the empowerment of women was a key element of India's progress, and she used her political platform to push for reforms in areas such as child marriage, dowry, and women's rights to property. Her work in this field extended beyond mere speeches and writings. She actively participated in campaigns for women's suffrage and spoke out against the social practices that oppressed women. In 1917, Naidu's activism took her to the forefront of the non-cooperation movement, led by Mahatma Gandhi. This movement, which called for Indians to refuse cooperation with British authorities through nonviolent means, represented a radical shift in the nationalist struggle. Sarojini Naidu embraced Gandhi's call for nonviolence and self-reliance, advocating for boycotts of British goods and institutions. She also became a fervent supporter of the Khadi movement, which encouraged Indians to weave their own cloth as an act of economic self-sufficiency. Naidu's speeches during this time were marked by a passionate rhetoric that combined the principles of nonviolence with the urgent need for political and social change. In the 1920s, Sarojini Naidu's political influence continued to grow. She was elected as the president of the Indian National Congress in 1925, becoming the first woman to hold this prestigious position. Her election as president was a significant milestone, not just for her personally, but for the recognition of women's political agency in India. It was also a testament to her ability to navigate the male-dominated political environment of the time and to earn the respect of her peers. As president of the Congress, Naidu played a crucial role in advocating for constitutional reforms and the promotion of the rights of the Indian people. Her leadership was marked by a vision of unity, where she sought to bridge the gap between different political factions and bring together the various regional and social groups within the Indian nationalist movement. Sarojini Naidu's contribution to the Indian independence movement was also recognized internationally. She traveled widely, speaking at conferences, rallies, and political gatherings in Europe and the United States. Her eloquent speeches and charismatic presence made her a popular figure on the world stage, where she advocated for Indian self-rule and garnered support for the cause of Indian independence. Naidu's diplomatic skills were invaluable in securing international recognition for India's struggle, and her role as a representative of Indian nationalism made her one of the leading voices of the independence movement in the global arena. The turning point in Naidu's political career came in 1930, when she was arrested during the Salt March led by Gandhi. The Salt March, a pivotal act of civil disobedience, was a direct challenge to British control over the production and sale of salt in India. Sarojini Naidu's arrest was a testament to her unwavering commitment to the cause of Indian independence. During her imprisonment, Naidu's resolve was unshaken, and she became a symbol of the resilience and determination of Indian women in the struggle for freedom. Sarojini Naidu's contributions to the cause of women's rights in India were as significant as her work in the literary and political spheres. While her poetry and activism played a crucial role in the fight for Indian independence, her unwavering advocacy for women's emancipation marked her as one of the foremost feminists of her time. Naidu's deep-seated belief in the equality of women and her vision of a liberated India were closely intertwined, and she viewed women's rights as a key aspect of India's social and political progress. From the very beginning of her public life, she demonstrated a profound understanding of the importance of empowering women in order to build a more just and equitable society. Sarojini Naidu's feminist views were influenced by her own upbringing in an intellectual household. Raised by progressive parents, she was encouraged to pursue her education and develop her intellect alongside her brothers. This early exposure to the idea of gender equality shaped her worldview and later fueled her passionate advocacy for women's rights. As a young woman, Naidu was acutely aware of the limitations imposed on women in India, especially in terms of education, social roles, and opportunities for independence. Her personal experiences as a woman in a male-dominated society gave her a unique perspective on the struggles that Indian women faced and made her a vocal advocate for change. One of the cornerstones of Sarojini Naidu's feminist activism was her tireless efforts to promote women's education. Naidu believed that education was the key to women's empowerment and saw it as an essential tool for breaking the shackles of social and cultural limitations. As early as the 1910s, she began speaking out against the traditional view that women should be confined to the domestic sphere and denied access to higher education. Through her speeches and writings, she urged women to pursue careers in the arts, sciences, and public life, believing that education could help them unlock their potential and contribute to the larger goals of Indian society. Her belief in women's education was also reflected in her role as a founder of the Women's Indian Association, WIA, in 1917, an organization that aimed to provide women with opportunities for political and social engagement. The WIA became a key platform for women's rights activism, promoting women's education, participation in the political process, and the fight for suffrage. Naidu's leadership in the WIA was instrumental in raising awareness about the need for women's involvement in the political and social reforms sweeping across India. She championed the idea that Indian women should not only be active participants in the struggle for independence, but should also take on leadership roles in their communities and in the larger political arena. In addition to her work with the Women's Indian Association, Sarojini Naidu was a vocal advocate for women's suffrage. She was one of the first Indian women to publicly demand voting rights for women, recognizing that political enfranchisement was an essential aspect of women's liberation. In the early 1920s, as the British colonial government began to engage in discussions about the future of India, Naidu worked alongside other prominent women leaders to demand that women be granted the right to vote. She argued that women, who played a critical role in the social and economic fabric of India, should have a say in the political decisions that affected their lives and the future of the nation. Her efforts to secure voting rights for women were not limited to speeches and rallies. Naidu also worked directly with political leaders to ensure that women's voices were heard at the national level. She lobbied within the Indian National Congress and other political organizations, urging them to prioritize women's rights in their agendas. Although full suffrage for women in India would not be achieved until after independence, Naidu's tireless work in this area helped lay the foundation for the eventual recognition of women's political rights in India. Sarojini Naidu's feminist activism extended beyond education and suffrage to include her calls for social and legal reforms. She campaigned against the practices of child marriage, dowry, and the exploitation of women in various forms. Naidu was deeply concerned with the social injustices that women suffered, particularly in rural areas, where traditional customs often led to the marginalization and oppression of women. She spoke out against the exploitation of women in the workplace, particularly in industries where they were paid little for their labor and subjected to harsh working conditions. Her advocacy for legal reforms aimed at protecting women's rights was a crucial part of her broader vision for a fair and just society. In her speeches, Naidu also emphasized the importance of women's economic independence. She believed that women should have control over their own finances and be able to support themselves through work or entrepreneurship. This idea of economic independence was closely tied to her larger feminist philosophy, which emphasized the need for women to have autonomy over their lives and choices. Sarojini Naidu's views on economic empowerment were revolutionary for the time, as she encouraged women to participate in the labor force and seek financial independence as a means of asserting their rights and their dignity. Another critical aspect of Sarojini Naidu's feminism was her recognition of the intersectionality of women's struggles. Naidu understood that the fight for women's rights in India could not be separated from the broader struggle for national independence and social justice. She believed that women's liberation was intrinsically linked to the fight for India's freedom from British rule. As a result, Naidu's feminist activism was inextricably bound up with her commitment to the nationalist cause. She saw the oppression of women as part of a larger system of colonial and patriarchal domination and believed that both had to be dismantled in order to create a just and equitable society. Sarojini Naidu's vision of women's liberation was not limited to the realm of political and social reforms. She also sought to challenge traditional cultural norms and redefine the role of women in Indian society. In her writings, she often portrayed women as strong, capable, and independent figures who were capable of contributing to society in meaningful ways. Her poems, such as The Palanquin Bearers and The Indian Women, celebrate the resilience and dignity of women in the face of societal expectations and hardships. Through her work, Naidu aimed to redefine the narrative surrounding women in Indian culture and provide a more empowering and inclusive vision of womanhood. Sarojini Naidu's advocacy for women's rights did not go unnoticed. She was widely regarded as a pioneering feminist and was often sought out by both Indian and international women's organizations for her leadership and insight. She spoke at various international forums on issues of women's empowerment, gender equality, and social justice, using her platform to raise awareness of the unique struggles faced by Indian women. Naidu's ability to articulate the connection between women's rights and the larger political struggle for Indian independence helped to frame women's liberation as an integral part of the nationalist movement. Sarojini Naidu's influence extended far beyond the borders of India, reaching across continents as she emerged as an international figure in the early 20th century. Her advocacy for India's independence and her work in championing women's rights earned her recognition on the global stage. As a leader of the Indian nationalist movement and a prominent figure in the struggle for Indian sovereignty, Naidu utilized international diplomacy and her literary talents to garner support for India's cause. Her ability to connect with audiences articulate India's plight under British rule, and advocate for social justice, made her an influential ambassador of India's struggle for freedom. One of the first significant international milestones in Naidu's career came in 1912, when she traveled to England to participate in political discussions and to present India's case for self-rule to British intellectuals and policymakers. Sarojini Naidu's visit to Britain marked the beginning of her efforts to communicate India's grievances with the British Empire in a direct and impactful way. During her time in England, she attended various conferences, participated in panel discussions, and made public appearances to speak about the aspirations of the Indian people for independence. Her eloquent speeches and the emotional weight of her words garnered much attention from British politicians and the international community, many of whom were struck by her profound understanding of both Indian culture and the broader political context of colonialism. In addition to her political engagements, Sarojini Naidu used her literary talents to further the cause of Indian nationalism. She wrote articles for British and European newspapers, offering powerful narratives that highlighted India's rich cultural heritage and the injustices inflicted upon the Indian people under colonial rule. Naidu's writings and international publications helped to humanize the Indian struggle and counteract the prevailing stereotypes of India as a land of poverty and backwardness. She painted a portrait of a vibrant, proud, and ancient civilization that had been subjected to exploitation by foreign powers. Her prose captured both the beauty and the complexity of India, thus fostering a greater understanding of her country's fight for freedom. In the 1920s, Sarojini Naidu's diplomatic efforts took on an even more global scale. As the Indian National Congress increasingly called for self-rule, Naidu traveled to various parts of the world to raise awareness about India's struggle for independence. Her international tours took her to countries like the United States, France, and Russia, where she spoke to large audiences about India's colonial experience and the moral imperative of granting Indians their freedom. During these tours, she was able to build alliances with like-minded individuals and organizations that supported Indian independence, including prominent leaders in the women's suffrage movement and other anti-colonial activists. Naidu's international outreach was crucial in expanding the global network of support for the Indian independence movement. One of the most significant moments of Sarojini Naidu's international diplomacy occurred in 1931 when she represented India at the Round Table Conference in London. The Round Table Conferences were a series of meetings between Indian leaders and British officials aimed at discussing India's future constitutional structure. Naidu, who was appointed as one of the Indian representatives, played an important role in articulating the demands of the Indian people for self-rule and equality. She used this international platform to press for India's right to self-determination and to emphasize the moral and ethical case for India's independence. Her presence at the conference marked her as a prominent leader not just in India, but on the global stage, where she was recognized for her intellect, diplomatic skill, and commitment to justice. Sarojini Naidu's diplomatic efforts were not limited to political negotiations. She also engaged in cultural diplomacy. She understood that in order to secure international support for India's cause, it was important to showcase the richness of Indian culture and traditions. As a poet and a cultural ambassador, Naidu performed readings of her works in countries across Europe and the United States, presenting India's artistic heritage as a testament to its greatness. Through her poetry, she conveyed the profound spirituality, beauty, and complexity of Indian life, helping to foster an appreciation for the cultural depth of her homeland. Her readings were often met with admiration, and many international audiences were moved by the beauty of her verses, which blended Eastern mysticism with Western literary techniques. At the same time, Naidu's diplomatic efforts went beyond the issue of Indian independence. She was an ardent advocate for international peace and cooperation. believing that the struggle for freedom was connected to broader global movements for justice and equality. Sarojini Naidu's international vision extended to advocating for the rights of women across the world, particularly in the context of the suffrage movement. She worked to strengthen the ties between Indian and Western feminists, finding common ground in their shared commitment to the liberation of women. Her speeches on women's rights and equality were influential in both India and the West, where she was celebrated as a symbol of women's empowerment and leadership. Throughout her travels, Naidu was often struck by the similarities between the struggles faced by women in different parts of the world. She saw that the fight for women's rights in India was part of a larger, global movement for the recognition of women's equality. She met with prominent suffragists such as Emmeline Pankhurst in England and spoke at suffrage rallies, urging women to unite in their pursuit of political and social justice. Naidu's belief in the power of solidarity among women was a key component of her diplomatic efforts, as she sought to build global networks of support for Indian women's rights, as well as the rights of women everywhere. Naidu's international recognition also brought her into contact with influential political figures, intellectuals, and activists from across the globe. In the United States, she was received by influential leaders like Eleanor Roosevelt, who admired her work in the women's rights movement. Her international stature helped to elevate the Indian cause and garner support from Western intellectuals who had previously been unaware or indifferent to the realities of British colonialism in India. By using her literary talents, her ability to speak powerfully about India's struggle, and her diplomatic acumen, Naidu helped to shape the global conversation about India's future. As a result of her tireless work in diplomacy, Sarojini Naidu became an emblematic figure in the international community. She was one of the first Indian women to be invited to speak at major international forums, including at the League of Nations and various global women's rights conferences. Her role as a representative of India's fight for freedom elevated her status as a key figure in the global anti-colonial movement, placing her on the same level as leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, and Subhash Chandra Bose. Naidu's international contributions, therefore, not only supported India's independence movement, but also positioned her as a trailblazer for women in the global diplomatic arena. Sarojini Naidu's role in the Indian independence movement and her contributions to the global struggle for justice and equality are indisputable. However, her legacy did not end with India's independence in 1947. Naidu's influence continued to resonate in post-independence India, where she became an enduring symbol of empowerment, intellectual prowess, and national pride. While she did not live to see India fully liberated from colonial rule, her impact on the nation's political, social, and cultural landscape left an indelible mark that would influence future generations. Sarojini Naidu's legacy in post-independence India can be seen in several key areas. In the empowerment of women, the shaping of India's political consciousness, and the preservation of its rich cultural heritage. As one of the leading women figures in the freedom struggle, Naidu's work served as a beacon for future generations of Indian women who sought to engage more actively in the political, social, and cultural spheres. Her commitment to women's education, rights, and political enfranchisement continued to inspire women's movements long after independence was achieved. In the years following 1947, Sarojini Naidu's contributions to women's empowerment were often cited by Indian leaders and feminists who pushed for reforms aimed at improving the position of women in the new republic. Naidu's work in promoting women's education, advocating for women's rights, and demanding women's political participation became foundational to the feminist movements that emerged in India during the post-independence era. Indian leaders such as Indira Gandhi, who would later become the country's first female prime minister, frequently spoke of Naidu's influence and the trail she had blazed for women in politics and leadership. Sarojini Naidu's impact on the political consciousness of post-independence India was also profound. Her political activism and her role as a key leader in the Indian National Congress helped shape the future direction of the country's democracy. As the first woman to become the president of the Indian National Congress in 1925, she had already made history within the political arena. In the years following independence, her legacy was celebrated not only for her contributions to India's fight for freedom, but also for her efforts in shaping the nation's democratic ethos. Naidu had emphasized unity, social justice, and the need for a government that represented all sectors of Indian society, values that continued to guide post-independence Indian leaders as they worked to establish a robust and inclusive democracy. Naidu's vision of a unified India that celebrated its diverse cultures, languages, and traditions also played a role in shaping post-independence cultural policy. As a poet and cultural ambassador, Sarojini Naidu had always placed immense value on India's rich heritage. Her poetry celebrated the landscapes, history, and people of India in a way that fostered national pride and unity. In the years following independence, her poetic works continued to be taught in schools, inspiring young Indians to take pride in their cultural roots. Naidu's belief in the importance of a unified national identity that embraced both modernity and tradition resonated with the nation as it navigated the complexities of post-colonial identity. Her deep love for India's diversity was reflected in her advocacy for the preservation of India's cultural practices, including traditional arts and crafts. Naidu was a staunch supporter of the Khadi movement, which sought to promote indigenous industries and reduce dependency on British goods. After independence, this emphasis on self-sufficiency and the celebration of Indian craftsmanship became a key feature of national economic and cultural policies. Naidu's advocacy for indigenous goods and cultural pride paved the way for the continued prominence of these ideas in the decades that followed, as the newly independent India sought to foster a national identity rooted in its rich cultural heritage. Naidu's legacy also extended to the field of education. Her belief in the transformative power of education for both women and men found a lasting echo in post-independence India's educational policies. The establishment of schools, colleges, and institutions that promoted gender equality, particularly for girls, was a continuation of the work that Sarojini Naidu had championed throughout her life. India's commitment to universal education, as enshrined in its constitution, can be seen as a direct outgrowth of the ideas Naidu espoused. Her lifelong commitment to education as the foundation for social and political change contributed to the formation of policies that focused on increasing educational access for women and marginalized communities. Another significant aspect of Naidu's legacy was her role in establishing the importance of diplomacy in India's post-independence foreign policy. As a diplomat and an internationally recognized figure, Naidu had demonstrated the value of representing India on the world stage. After independence, India continued to uphold the ideals of diplomacy and peaceful engagement with the international community, drawing inspiration from leaders like Naidu, who had skillfully navigated the intricacies of foreign policy and international relationships. Her work in establishing India's voice on the global stage laid the groundwork for the country's future in the United Nations and its efforts to build relationships with newly independent nations around the world. Sarojini Naidu's emphasis on nonviolence and her unwavering commitment to peace and justice also found a lasting echo in post-independence India. Gandhi's principles of nonviolence remained at the heart of India's foreign and domestic policies, and Naidu's unwavering belief in peaceful resistance continued to shape India's identity as a country committed to peace. Her work in promoting nonviolence, both as a political strategy and a way of life, served as a guiding principle for future Indian leaders in their engagement with the world. Naidu's legacy is also enshrined in the public recognition she received posthumously. Her name became synonymous with the struggle for Indian independence, women's rights, and cultural preservation. Schools, streets, and institutions across India were named in her honor, ensuring that future generations would remember her contributions to the nation. The establishment of the Sarojini Naidu National Women's University in Hyderabad in 1991 further cemented her status as a pioneer of women's education and empowerment in India. Her legacy as a leader, poet, and activist continues to inspire countless women and men to take action in their own communities, striving to make India a better, more inclusive place. In the literary world, Sarojini Naidu's poetry continued to inspire readers and poets alike. Her ability to blend traditional Indian themes with Western literary forms created a unique style that resonated with people across the world. In post-independence India, her works were included in anthologies of modern Indian poetry, and she was celebrated as one of the country's foremost poets. Her poems, especially those that invoke the beauty of India's landscapes and the strength of its people, were studied in schools and universities, serving as an enduring testament to her literary genius. Sarojini Naidu's identity as a poet was not just an extension of her intellect, but a deeply rooted expression of her emotional and cultural being. Over time, her literary style underwent a profound evolution, reflecting the shifting landscapes of her inner world and the external pressures of the socio-political climate in colonial India. While her early works brimmed with romantic lyricism and ornate imagery, her later poetry adopted subtler, more layered forms of resistance, rich in symbolism and nationalistic undertones. This transformation marked her journey from a young lyrical artist into a mature voice of her people. Naidu's early poetry was steeped in the lush beauty of India's natural and cultural surroundings. She painted vivid pictures of village life, temple rituals, and romantic landscapes, using a vocabulary reminiscent of the British Romantics, yet rooted in Indian sensibilities. Her first volume, The Golden Threshold, 1905, was an ode to the India of her youth, full of color, fragrance, and music. The poems in this collection are characterized by their melodic quality, sensuous imagery, and themes of love, longing, and mysticism. Her language flowed like song, often drawing comparisons to Shelley and Tennyson, yet always retaining a distinct Indian flavor through her choice of subjects like palanquin bearers, wandering beggars, and temple bells. As the poet matured, her work began to reflect a deeper awareness of the world around her. In The Bird of Time, 1912, Naidu's poems display a shift toward more introspective and philosophical themes. While she continued to draw upon the aesthetics of nature, there was a newfound tension between beauty and suffering, between permanence and change. Her poetic voice grew more contemplative, influenced by the inner conflicts of a woman balancing artistic sensibility with political awakening. Poems in this collection often explore the impermanence of life, the fleeting nature of joy, and the quiet endurance of grief, expressed through metaphors of passing seasons, dying stars, and fragile birds. The evolution of Naidu's poetic identity is most powerfully seen in her third collection, The Broken Wing, 1917. This volume reflects a woman who had now become fully entrenched in the cause of Indian nationalism, yet continued to find solace and expression through verse. Her poems began to resonate with a quiet defiance, an emotional register that spoke of pain, resistance, and hope. The symbolism became richer. The broken wing, itself representing a wounded yet striving nation. Without being overtly political, these poems conveyed a powerful undercurrent of yearning for liberation and dignity. Naidu used allegory and mythological references to veil her resistance, making her poetry both subtle and potent. A hallmark of Sarojini Naidu's literary evolution was her mastery of symbolic duality. She could describe a bangle seller's wares and simultaneously evoke the entire life cycle of an Indian woman, from maidenhood to widowhood. Her poem, Bangle Sellers, is a poignant example of how she fused social commentary with lyrical grace. In just a few stanzas, Naidu encapsulates the expectations placed upon women, their limited choices, and the societal rhythms that govern their lives. The bangles are more than jewelry. They become metaphors for destiny, sacrifice, and silent endurance. Another recurring symbol in Naidu's poetry is the bird, which appears in various forms, often representing the soul, freedom, or the fleeting nature of dreams, whether caged or in flight. The bird serves as a central motif that links personal longing with collective aspiration. In many poems, it symbolizes the desire to transcend worldly constraints, both emotional and political. In this sense, her poetry can be read as a chronicle of liberation, personal, cultural, and national. Sarojini Naidu's use of Indian mythology and folklore further grounded her work in a cultural context that was both familiar to her compatriots and exotic to Western audiences. She skillfully drew upon figures from Hindu epics, legends, and religious symbolism, not to preach, but to universalize the themes of love, duty, courage, and sorrow. By invoking characters such as Radha and Krishna, or images of sacred rivers and celestial beings, Naidu connected the everyday with the eternal. These references helped her preserve cultural identity at a time when British colonization sought to erode indigenous knowledge systems. In terms of form and structure, Naidu's poetry followed the conventional metrical patterns of English poetry, yet she infused these forms with Indian rhythm and cadence. Her poems often possessed a musical quality that reflected her background in Indian classical music and oratory. She understood the power of sound, and many of her verses, though written in English, carried the tonalities of Hindi, Urdu, and Telugu, the languages she grew up with. This linguistic synthesis made her poetry uniquely cross-cultural, speaking to both Indian and Western audiences with equal resonance. Naidu's later poems, especially those unpublished or collected posthumously, reveal a more subdued, introspective tone. These works often reflect personal loss, the burden of public life, and the cost of idealism. The vibrancy of her earlier imagery gives way to quieter reflections on mortality, legacy, and spiritual continuity. Yet even in these late poems, there's an unmistakable undercurrent of hope, a belief in rebirth, in the undying soul of a nation and of the individual spirit. Her voice, while more restrained, remains unwavering in its grace and compassion. Ultimately, Sarojini Naidu's literary journey was not merely about artistic expression. It was an act of cultural preservation and defiance. She carved a space for Indian identity within the framework of English literature, refusing to let her homeland's beauty and complexity be lost to colonial narratives. Her poetry, though often read for its lyricism, should also be recognized as a tool of subtle resistance, a mirror of evolving consciousness, and a testament to the enduring spirit of a woman who wielded the pen as skillfully as she did the podium. Naidu's poetic evolution tells the story of a woman who never abandoned her artistry, even as she took on the burdens of leadership and activism. Her words remain not just in the pages of anthologies, but in the cultural memory of India, as reminders of the power of poetic symbolism, the resilience of the creative spirit, and the enduring dialogue between art and freedom. In the twilight of her life, Sarojini Naidu occupied a position both revered and burdensome. Having lived through decades of struggle, transformation, and triumph, she found herself in a newly independent India, not as a mere observer, but as an integral figure helping to shape the identity of a nascent republic. As the first woman to become the governor of an Indian state, United Provinces, now Uttar Pradesh, her final years were spent not in quiet retirement, but in dedicated public service. Her appointment to this role symbolized the culmination of a life devoted to justice, equality, and nation-building, and it was a recognition of the tremendous contributions she had made to the country's social and political fabric. Despite the toll that decades of activism had taken on her health, Naidu maintained her characteristic vitality. Her schedule remained demanding. She gave speeches, met with delegations, advised emerging leaders, and participated in ceremonial functions. Her presence at public events was met with admiration and nostalgia. People saw in her a living embodiment of India's long, painful journey toward freedom, a poetic soul who had once stood alongside Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, and who now served the very republic they had all fought to create. Her official residence in Lucknow became both a workplace and a sanctuary, filled with the echoes of her past. Photographs, books, and letters from her years of activism adorned the walls. Her desk remained cluttered with official files and manuscripts of unfinished poems. Even as governor, she retained her identity as a writer, often retreating in the evenings to her room to write letters or compose verses. Those close to her observed that while her physical strength may have waned, her spirit remained indomitable. Her words, even in private conversations, carried the same lyricism and conviction that had defined her public persona. Throughout these final years, Sarojini Naidu remained deeply engaged in mentoring younger politicians and social activists. Many came to her not only for advice, but also for reassurance in a time of great transition. India, having just achieved independence, was navigating new and uncertain terrain, defining its democratic institutions, managing regional tensions, and striving to ensure unity in diversity. Naidu's long experience in dealing with both British authorities and internal political divisions made her a valuable source of wisdom. She encouraged patience, diplomacy, and empathy, qualities that she believed were essential to sustaining the democratic spirit of the new nation. Her familial bonds also offered a source of solace and continuity. Though many of her children had taken different paths, they shared a sense of pride in their mother's achievements. Her daughter Padmaja, in particular, followed closely in her footsteps, engaging in politics and social work. Their relationship, both tender and intellectually vibrant, reflected Naidu's own belief in generational empowerment and the enduring value of public service. The warmth and closeness of her family life contrasted with the formality of her public role, offering a balance that grounded her amid the pressures of governance. As she aged, the physical demands of her position became more challenging. Frequent travels, ceremonial obligations, and the weight of public expectations began to take a toll. Still, Naidu refused to withdraw or delegate key responsibilities. She felt a deep obligation to continue contributing until the very end, aware that her generation of freedom fighters was fast becoming the last living link to a pivotal chapter in India's history. Her perseverance was not driven by ego, but by a profound sense of duty and an unwavering belief in the ideal she had championed throughout her life. Her death on March 2, 1949, at the government house in Lucknow came as a solemn moment for the nation. She passed away in her sleep, reportedly after a full day of meetings and administrative work, a final testament to her lifelong commitment to service. News of her passing spread rapidly, and tributes poured in from across the country and the world. Political leaders, poets, and citizens alike mourned the loss of a figure who had bridged the worlds of literature and politics, of personal grace and public resilience. Her funeral was attended by dignitaries from every corner of the nation, and her memory was invoked in countless speeches, poems, and editorials. In the days following her passing, public commemorations highlighted different aspects of her multifaceted life. Some remembered her as the Nightingale of India, whose poetry had once enchanted both Indian and Western audiences. Others focused on her fiery speeches, her unflinching activism, and her rare ability to blend feminine charm with political strength. Yet others reflected on her role as a trailblazer for women's participation in Indian public life. Each tribute painted a piece of a larger mosaic, revealing the depth and complexity of a woman who had lived for something far greater than herself. Sarojini Naidu's life, as much as her work, became a touchstone for discussions about national identity, gender equality, and the role of art in social change. Her legacy lived on not only in the institutions she helped shape, but also in the ethos of a country still grappling with its post-colonial identity. Schools and colleges began incorporating her life and works into their curricula, and statues were erected in her honor. More than mere remembrance, these acts signified a continued engagement with her ideals, proof that her voice, though silenced in death, still resonated in the heart of India. Today, long after her final breath, Sarojini Naidu's story continues to inspire. Her life was a confluence of intellect and emotion, poetry and politics, tenderness and tenacity. She did not just witness history. She shaped it gracefully, defiantly, and poetically. In the annals of Indian history, she remains not merely a freedom fighter or a poet, but a symbol of what it means to live with purpose and conviction. Her final years, though lived in the shadow of age, were filled with light, echoes of a life fully lived, and a legacy that continues to bloom with each new generation.